Okay, so let's unpack this. We are looking at a major shift from December 2025 in the Horn of Africa. Israel formally recognizes Somaliland.
Right, which is historic.
Yeah, it is the first country to do so since their 1991 Declaration of Independence. And for those of you who follow the region, this is the diplomatic breakthrough Hargeisa has been chasing for over 3 decades.
It is a massive shift in the status quo.
Yeah.
You have an unrecognized state that has functioned as a democracy for 30 years, finally getting a nod from a major geopolitical player. It really redefines the map.
It does. But while Hargeisa is celebrating, the reaction right next door in Djibouti has been, well, let's call it explosive.
Explosive is the right word. The reaction from Djibouti wasn't just a polite diplomatic protest note. It was sharp, hostile, and immediate. And that is exactly what we are focusing on today.
Right. We are jumping into a detailed analysis today. The source is a piece titled Djibouti's Fear of Somaliland's Rise, and the subtitle is Why Development Should Not Be Seen as a Threat.
It is a great piece.
It is. And the mission of this deep dive is fascinating because the premise argues that while all the headlines are shouting about security threats and foreign bases, those are really just smoke signals.
Yeah, they are. If you strip away all that diplomatic rhetoric, this isn't a story about military strategy in the traditional sense. It is a story about a monopoly facing its first real competitor.
Right, it's a David versus Goliath story, but with logistics.
Exactly. It's about money logistics and the specific anxieties of a rentier state that sees its absolute primary revenue stream under siege.
So let's start with the catalyst. We have the recognition event, and then we have this interview that the president of Djibouti, Ismail Omar Gala, gave to Jeune Afrique. He didn't exactly hold back.
Well, he came out swinging. And it is important to parse the specific language he used in that source. He didn't just criticize the diplomatic move, he framed it as an existential threat to the entire Horn of Africa.
Right.
He specifically warned that an Israeli military presence in the port city of Berbera would completely destabilize the region.
Which is a really heavy accusation. He is essentially taking a bilateral diplomatic agreement between Somaliland and Israel and framing it to the world as a regional security crisis.
Precisely. And he expanded that threat matrix to include the UAE. He accused the United Arab Emirates of acting as Israel's gateway into the Horn.
So making it a proxy issue.
Right. The narrative he is actively constructing is that Somaliland isn't acting as a sovereign entity at all, but rather as a Trojan horse for foreign powers that want to infiltrate the region.
It is a classic delegitimization tactic. If you paint them as puppets, you don't have to engage with them as peers.
Exactly.
But Somaliland's president Abdirahman Mohamed Abdullahi Iro had a very different take on this.
The contrast was incredibly stark. While Gela was out there projecting external chaos, Iro was focused entirely on internal stability. His message to the people of Somaliland was all about unity and solidarity.
Yeah.
His core argument, according to the source, was that Somaliland has harmed absolutely no one, and that their pursuit of recognition and development is a sovereign right, not an act of aggression.
It is the difference between shouting fire in a crowded theater and telling everyone to just stay in their seats.
That is a good way to put it.
But let's get to the core of the source material. Why is Djibouti so rattled? We know they are neighbors, but the sheer intensity of this reaction suggests something way deeper than just neighborly jealousy.
To understand the panic in Djibouti, you really have to look at the country's economic architecture. For decades, Djibouti has essentially been the strategic gatekeeper of the Red Sea. We are talking about the Bab el-Mandeb Strait here.
Right, where a massive percentage of global trade has to squeeze through every day.
Exactly. And Djibouti has monetized that specific geography better than almost anyone else.
Yeah.
But their economy is incredibly concentrated. It relies on two main pillars. First, the leasing of land for foreign military bases.
And the second?
The second, and arguably much more critical for their daily economic operations, is their monopoly on port access for Ethiopia.
This is the key link, because Ethiopia is a demographic giant, right? Over 120 million people, but it is completely landlocked.
Yes. And historically, something like 95% of Ethiopia's maritime trade has gone straight through Djibouti. That is a stranglehold.
Wow, 95%.
Yeah, it's a massive, steady revenue stream that basically funds the Djiboutian state. They built their entire debt servicing model, including all the huge loans for the Djibouti-Addis Railway,
Right.
on the absolute assumption that they would always be the only game in town.
So when we talk about Somaliland and the port of Berbera, we aren't just talking about a new dock opening up down the coast. We are talking about a direct threat to a national monopoly.
That is the disruptor.
Hmm.
The port of Berbera hasn't just been patched up, it has been fundamentally modernized and expanded by DP World. It is now a highly serious deep-water logistical hub.
Yeah.
And when Somaliland signed that memorandum of understanding with Ethiopia for port access, the alarm bells in Djibouti City must have been absolutely deafening.
Because every single container that goes through Berbera is a container that isn't paying a fee in Djibouti.
Correct. And it is not just the fees, it is the leverage. Djibouti has been able to use its geographic position to exert immense political influence over Ethiopia simply because Addis Ababa had nowhere else to go.
Right.
If Ethiopia has a viable alternative in Berber Djibouti's, geopolitical leverage just evaporates.
The source actually mentions that Djiboutian officials felt stabbed in the back by the Ethiopia deal, which is really interesting phrasing for international trade.
It is. It implies a sense of ownership over Ethiopia's logistics. But as the analysis points out clearly, Somaliland's actions aren't illegal. They're just standard economic diversification.
Yeah, they're just building infrastructure to attract customers.
Exactly. Djibouti is reacting to basic market competition as if it were a military blockade.
That is the real pivot point of this whole deep dive.
Hmm.
Galay is framing a commercial problem-losing market share as a security threat. And that brings us to the second part of the analysis regarding the military bases, because this is where the source material highlights some massive irony.
Irony is putting it politely. It is a highly calculated double standard. Remember, Guell is actively criticizing Somaliland for potentially hosting Israeli assets or working with the UAE, and he is calling it destabilizing.
Meanwhile, Djibouti is basically the world's landlord for military bases.
It is the most militarized real estate in Africa.
Yeah.
You have the Americans at Camp Lemonnier. You have the Chinese support base literally right down the road from them.
Yeah.
You have the French, the Japanese, the Italians. And crucially, the source notes, they continue to provide base access to Saudi Arabia as well.
So let's be crystal clear about this for everyone listening. Djibouti hosts competing global powers, China and the U.S., miles apart from each other. They take rent from absolutely everyone. But they're claiming that if Somaliland does the exact same thing, the whole neighborhood is going to go up in flames.
That is the logical flaw the source exposes so well. If leasing territory to foreign militaries is a legitimate survival strategy for Djibouti, a way to guarantee its own security and its revenue, then on what grounds is it wrong for Somaliland to explore similar partnerships?
It sounds like Gelly isn't really worried about foreign presence in the abstract. He is worried about competition in the sovereignty leasing market.
That is a cynical but highly accurate way to view it. If Berbera becomes a viable location for foreign navies that drives down the premium Djibouti can charge, it is basic supply and demand.
Yeah.
Djibouti has enjoyed a supplier's market for strategic real estate for a long time. Somaliland entering the chat completely changes the pricing model.
So the loud rhetoric about destabilization is really just a cover for protecting a business model.
It serves a dual purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Internationally, it tries to scare off potential partners for Somaliland, but domestically, it serves an even more critical function. And this is where we really need to look at the internal politics of Djibouti, which the source spends time on.
Right, because none of this is happening in a vacuum. President Gül has been in power since 1999. That is a very long tenure.
It is. And recently, there has been significant political maneuvering to justify constitutional changes that would allow him to seek yet another term. When you have a leader who has been in power for over a quarter of a century looking to extend his rule, he needs a rock-solid justification.
And nothing justifies staying the course quite like a crisis.
Exactly. The narrative of an external threat is the oldest trick in the autocrat's handbook. By painting Somaliland and Israel as an imminent existential danger, Gül can argue to his people that now is not the time for a leadership transition.
Right.
He positions himself as the only steady hand capable of steering the ship through these dangerous waters.
So the external conflict becomes the absolute fuel for internal political survival. It is like a sleight of hand. Don't look at the poverty. Don't look at the lack of democracy.
Yes.
Look at the scary enemies at the gate.
Right. It completely deflects attention from pressing domestic issues. And the source makes a very sharp point here. It argues that this only I can save you logic actually undermines the Djiboutian people themselves. Well, it implies a kind of democratic stagnation. It suggests that the nation's institutions are so fundamentally weak that they would just collapse without this one specific man at the helm.
It definitely paints a picture of a fragile system. And that fragility seems to really stem from how they view economics at a base level. The source talks a lot about this zero-sum mentality.
This is critical for you to understand the regional dynamic. The leadership in Djibouti appears to be operating under the firm belief that the total amount of prosperity in the Horn of Africa is fixed.
Like a pie.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Therefore, if Somaliland's economy rises, Djibouti's must fall. They view a cargo ship docking in Berbera as a direct dollar-for-dollar deduction from their own GDP.
Which, to be fair, in the very short term, if a specific ship switches ports, that is a loss of a specific fee for that day. But is that the right way to view regional economics in the long run?
Most modern economic theory, certainly the argument our source is making today, would say no. This is what they call regional maturity. The Horn of Africa as a whole is severely underdeveloped. It suffers from poverty, infrastructure deficits, and widespread food insecurity.
So it is not exactly a saturated market where they are fighting over the last scrap.
Far from it. A prosperous Berbera creates a brand new growth pull. It opens up the eastern regions of Ethiopia, which are currently massively underserved. It creates new trade corridors that can actually increase the total volume of trade flowing into the entire region.
So the pie gets bigger.
The pie gets bigger. Increased trade in Somaliland could lead to cross-border opportunities, energy cooperation, and a much more stable region overall, which is good for investment everywhere, including Djibouti.
Yeah.
But you cannot see that if you are completely fixated on maintaining a 100% monopoly on existing flows.
The source actually suggests that Djibouti should have been using its monopoly rents, all that cash they pulled in from the last 20 years, to diversify its own economy so it wouldn't be this terrified of a little competition today.
That is the diversify or die reality of modern economics. Djibouti has had a massive head start. They have collected billions in port fees and lease payments.
Right.
The source argues that instead of using their diplomatic capital to aggressively attack Somaliland, they should be focusing on using their actual capital to fix the poverty rate at home, to build domestic industries that aren't just essentially toll booths.
It is a really compelling argument. If your nation's stability relies entirely on your neighbor remaining isolated and poor, that is not really stability. That is just a holding pattern.
And holding patterns eventually run out of fuel. The formal recognition of Somaliland by Israel is the blaring signal that the holding pattern is broken. The world is moving on. Somaliland is integrating into the global system, whether Djibouti likes it or not.
So what is the actual path forward here? The source seems to strongly advocate for cooperation, but given the current hostile rhetoric from Gala, that feels like a pretty long shot.
It might be a long shot in the immediate short term, but it is the only rational long-term play. The source concludes that the region desperately needs to treat logistics as logistics, not as war. Imagine a scenario where the Durala container terminal in Djibouti and the port of Berbera are integrated into a single cooperative regional network.
You would have redundancy, efficiency, much better rates for Ethiopia.
You would turn the entire Horn of Africa into a global logistics powerhouse. But that requires Djibouti to first accept that Somaliland is a reality. You cannot unring the bell of international recognition. Somaliland is here.
Yeah.
The question for Djibouti now is whether they want a prosperous partner next door or if they want to exhaust themselves fighting a reality they cannot change.
It really highlights the inherent danger of the rentier mindset. When your state doesn't produce things but just charges people a toll for passing through you, are incredibly vulnerable to a new road being built.
That is the fundamental vulnerability, and Gelly knows it. That is exactly why the reaction is so visceral. It is not just about national pride. It is about the actual financial solvency of the state model he has built over decades.
So to pull this all together for you listening at home, we have a historic diplomatic breakthrough with Israel and Somaliland. Djibouti reacts with extreme hostility, citing security and regional destabilization.
But the underlying driver, as the source clearly outlines, is the direct threat to Djibouti's economic monopoly on Ethiopian trade and the incredibly lucrative market of military-based leasing.
And we see a very clear double standard where Djibouti engages in the exact same practices, hosting multiple foreign powers that it aggressively accuses Somaliland of exploiting.
All while actively using this manufactured external crisis to justify internal political continuity for a president who is seeking to extend his decades-long rule.
It is a classic textbook case of using geopolitics to mask domestic and economic fragility.
It is. And it is a great reminder that in international relations, you always have to follow the money. When a leader starts shouting about sacred sovereignty and regional destabilization, check their balance sheet, usually the real answer is right there in the ledger.
That is a great point. And it leaves us with something really important to think about regarding the future of the region. The source strongly suggests Djibouti should look inward and diversify.
It is the only truly sustainable path.
Because here's the final thought I want to leave you with today. We often think of national security as tanks and borders and military alliances. But if your national security collapses simply because a neighbor opens a new grocery store, or in this specific case, a modern port, were you ever really secure in the first place?
That is the million-dollar question.
Or is true security only found when your neighbors are prosperous enough to trade with you rather than just forced to pay you rent? It really seems like relying on a monopoly is a great strategy right up until the day it isn't. And for Djibouti, that day might be today.
The market always finds a way around a monopoly eventually.
We will definitely be watching to see if they choose competition or conflict in the coming months. This has been a deep dive into the shifting sands of the Horn of Africa. Thanks for helping us navigate all this complexity.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for listening. We will see you on the next deep dive.